I'm starving, old man, I'll give you my Ferrari if you can start it. Starving old man. I'll give you my Ferrari if you can start it. Julian Arce shouted between laughs, pointing mockingly in front of everyone. I'll give you my Ferrari if you can start it. Ha ha ha. The room erupted in laughter. Suited men and women in evening gowns looked on with contempt, celebrating the humiliation as if it were a performance. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, the car's brilliant red reflected the millionaire's arrogance. Off to the side, Don Ernesto Salgado stood motionless. His wrinkled face, his worn-out jacket, and his downcast eyes revealed exhaustion and pain, but also a silent dignity that no one there could recognize. While the others enjoyed themselves at his expense, he clutched the jacket on his shoulder as if holding on to the last shred of pride he had left. That moment was the beginning of a confrontation that no one at that gala would ever forget. Before we begin this thrilling story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and hit the like button to keep following along. Mexico City sparkled that night like a stage built for gods. At the Centro Citibanamex, white and gold lights fell upon a car that seemed to breathe. The red Ferrari rested on an acrylic platform surrounded by velvet ropes. It wasn't just a car. It was an altar. Every glint on the bodywork was hypnotic. Every reflection in the crystal made guests raise their glasses as if celebrating a personal victory. The initial roar of the engine still vibrated in everyone's chests. That deep, metallic sound had cut through the air like a controlled thunderclap. It smelled of refined gasoline, freshly stitched leather, of triumph. It was a perfume the attendees associated with power. And at the center of this entire orchestra of vanity stood Julian Arce, a custom-made black suit, an Italian silk tie, the insolent gleam of a Swiss watch that captured light like a small sun. He walked among the guests with that smile that mixes confidence and contempt. The expression of someone who has never heard the word no. Listen, he said, running his fingertips over the steering wheel. He revved it gently, and the roar returned, deep, perfect. The echo bounced off the walls of the hall like an amplified heartbeat. There were applause, whistles, excited laughter. Julian tilted his head, enjoying being the center of gravity for the night. But on the edge of this circle of luxury, a contrast emerged like a stain on the polished marble. An old man, hunched over, in a worn-out coat that had lost its color and shape. His shoes looked like they had survived too many rains. His beard grew untamed, mixing gray hairs and dust. The security guard noticed him immediately and raised his hand with a stern gesture. "Sir, please keep your distance." The old man didn't protest. He barely raised his palms in a sign of peace, with a respect that hurt more than any plea. His eyes, however, didn't move from the car. He looked at the Ferrari with a tenderness that no millionaire in that room could understand. It wasn't greed, wasn't the desire to own it, it was memory, like someone gazing at the portrait of a lost child. A woman in an emerald green dress, Fernanda, saw him stop by the velvet rope. She watched him silently for a few seconds, surprised by how his hands trembled, not from cold, but from contained emotion. "Do you like it?" she asked softly, almost afraid to interrupt that intimate moment. The old man nodded slowly, without words. He tried to smile, but his throat was closed by an invisible knot. He breathed in deeply, as if needing to fill his lungs with that scent of hot metal. In his gaze there was something more than admiration, a hidden gleam of someone who recognizes what others merely observe. Julian, meanwhile, had noticed the scene. He approached with calculated steps, enjoying the effect he caused. His shadow fell over the old man like a sudden eclipse. The room fell silent for a few seconds, and the electronic music cut off right at that instant, as if the universe were setting the stage for the first blow. The engine stopped roaring, and before the lights could change color, a dry laugh from Julian cut through the air, opening a corridor of expectant glances. The invisible thread holding the old man was about to stretch until it snapped. The echo of Julian's laughter spread like a whip over the silence. The guests turned their heads toward him, ready to applaud any word that came out of his mouth. At these gatherings, no one wanted to be his enemy. Everyone preferred to laugh even if they didn't understand the joke. "Well, look at that," he exclaimed, pointing at the old man with his index finger as if he were part of a show. "You can't even afford food, old man. What are you doing looking at my Ferrari like it's yours?" Laughter erupted around them. Some was genuine, some uncomfortable, but it all resonated like a wall against the man in the worn-out coat. Fernanda lowered her gaze, embarrassed by the cruelty disguised as humor. The guard tried to move the old man along, but he didn't budge. He remained firm, his eyes fixed on the car, as if those words bounced off an invisible wall built with memories stronger than any humiliation. The old man swallowed hard. His jaw trembled, but not from fear. It was contained rage, an ancient fire he preferred not to show. However, his hands betrayed a slight tremor, as if each laugh was a direct blow to his empty stomach. "Leave him, Camillo," Julian ordered the guard, raising his hand like a magnanimous emperor. "Let's have some fun." The crowd moved closer, forming a semicircle, wine glasses and cell phones held high. The air smelled of expensive perfume mixed with the tension of an improvised spectacle. Julian walked to the front of the Ferrari and, with a theatrical voice, delivered his final insult. "You know what, old man? I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse." He turned to his audience, savoring the anticipation. "If you can start my Ferrari with your own hands, I'll give it to you." The explosion of laughter was immediate. Some even applauded the joke. The phrase, so absurd, seemed like the perfect punchline for a night of ostentation. "Come on, Julian," shouted a man, glass in hand. "That poor guy doesn't even know what a modern engine is, he couldn't even start a bicycle," added another, provoking more laughs. The old man raised his eyes to Julian for the first time. His gaze wasn't pleading or fearful. It was a silent edge, a reflection of dignity buried under years of neglect. The millionaire didn't notice. He was too caught up in his role as a cruel jester before a compliant audience. Fernanda watched the old man's face, and something inside her trembled. She had seen defeated looks many times, but that one wasn't it. There was a dangerous calm, the same calm of someone who knows secrets others ignore. "What do you say, old man?" Julian insisted, dangling the keys as if they were another insult. "Do you accept my challenge?" The room held its breath. No one expected that man to respond. It was too absurd to even imagine him approaching the machine everyone worshipped like a sacred object. The old man blinked slowly. Then, with a hoarse but clear voice, he spoke words no one expected to hear. "I accept." The collective murmur turned into a sea of disbelief. Everyone's eyes widened, and even the laughter froze mid-air. The old man's calm had pierced through the frivolity like an invisible knife. Julian, for the first time that night, lost his smile. The murmuring hadn't even died down. The guests, wine glasses in hand and the gleam of chandeliers reflecting off their jewels, kept staring incredulously at the old man who had broken the night's rhythm. Don Ernesto Salgado, with his shabby coat and unkempt beard, had spoken two words that didn't seem to fit that luxurious setting. "I accept." The echo of that response left the room in suspense, and the electronic music that started playing again barely masked the electricity in the air. Everyone looked at each other, searching for an explanation. Had the old man actually taken Julian Arce's joke seriously? The millionaire, still with his sharp smile, straightened his tie and feigned indifference. He couldn't show doubt in front of his audience. He walked slowly toward the car, enjoying being the center of attention, and held out the keys with a theatrical gesture. "Well, go ahead, Mr. Nobody. If you want it so badly, start it. Surprise us." The laughter multiplied. Some recorded with their phones, convinced this would end as a viral video of a homeless man making a fool of himself. Others took quick sips, as if not wanting to miss a single detail. The guard, Camillo, shifted uncomfortably, but Julian stopped him with an arrogant gesture. He wanted a show. Don Ernesto moved toward the platform. His footsteps echoed on the marble, slow, heavy, contrasting with the gleaming shoes and heels of the others. He seemed in no hurry, and that strange calm began to unsettle more than a few. "What does he think he's going to do?" a woman whispered. "He won't even know where the button is," a man replied with a laugh. But Fernanda Villalobos wasn't laughing. There was something in the old man's expression she found impossible to ignore. His hands trembled, yes, but not like someone scared, like an artist before their instrument after too long an absence. That trembling was pure, contained emotion, like a river about to break its dams. Julian twirled the keys between his fingers and, in an act of contempt, threw them to the ground. They fell with a dry jingle near the old man's feet. There were more laughs. Don Ernesto bent down, picked up the keys gently, and stared at them for a few seconds. His fingers caressed them with a delicacy that puzzled those watching closely. No one understood why that gesture seemed so intimate. "Come on, old man, show us your magic," Julian said, spreading his arms like a master of ceremonies. The old man got into the car. The crowd fell silent instantly. Seated in the leather seat, he closed his eyes for a moment. He inhaled the interior smell, worked leather, oil, hot metal. It was a scent that penetrated to his very bones. He placed his hands on the steering wheel with solemn respect, and for a second, he no longer seemed like a beggar, but someone returning home after a long exile. The guests began to grow restless. Some whispered, others moved in closer to record. "Come on. Start it already." A young man laughed from the back, but Don Ernesto didn't rush. First, he adjusted the seat with precise movements. Then he touched the gear shift, stroking it with the back of his fingers as if greeting an old friend. Then he scanned the dashboard with his eyes, and they lit up with a brief, unmistakable flash. Fernanda watched him, her heart racing. This wasn't an amateur improvising. There was a secret memory there that no one could yet decipher. Finally, Don Ernesto inserted the key. The entire room held its breath. The old man's finger rested on the ignition button, and then he turned his wrist with a disconcerting calm. The roar of the engine was about to decide who would laugh and who would fall silent that night. The silence was so thick you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Everyone waited with bated breath, ready to laugh if the engine didn't respond, or to be amazed if, by some improbable miracle, the old man managed something. Don Ernesto turned the key with a firm, almost ceremonial movement. The Ferrari's engine responded with a deep, powerful roar that filled the hall like a metallic thunderclap. The echo bounced off the windows, made the chandeliers vibrate, seeped into the chest of every guest. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Surprise, disbelief, even fear. Julian Arce blinked, thrown off. His smile disappeared for the first time that night. He had expected utter failure, easy comedy. Instead, the old man had awakened the machine as if born with it. Don Ernesto remained unmoved by the reactions. With the engine running, he sat still for a few seconds, listening to the roar like someone recognizing a familiar voice. Then he caressed the steering wheel with his fingertips and murmured something barely audible, a whisper that only Fernanda caught, as if he'd never been silenced. She looked at him, surprised. It wasn't the phrase of a stranger. It was someone speaking to an old friend. The guests began to react. Some applauded nervously, others recorded frantically. The laughter had vanished. In its place reigned a mix of fascination and bewilderment. "How? How did he do it?" a man asked aloud. "Must have been luck," another replied, trying to regain a mocking tone, though his voice trembled. Julian, irritated, stepped forward. He couldn't let the scene slip through his fingers. "All right, old man. You managed to start it. So what? Does that make you the owner of my Ferrari?" His tone tried to be sarcastic, but his nervousness betrayed him. Don Ernesto calmly turned off the engine and slowly got out of the car. There was no pride in his gestures, nor fear, only serenity. He held out the keys toward Julian, not quite extending them fully, as if reminding him that the promise was still on the table. "You said you'd give it to me if I started it." His voice was deep, firm, without a tremor. The crowd murmured again. Cell phones recorded every word. It was no longer a private spectacle, it was a public trial. Julian forced a laugh. It was a joke, old man. No one expected you to actually try. He looked around for support. Several people laughed, but the laughter sounded hollow, like an echo without conviction. Fernanda, however, couldn't take her eyes off Don Ernesto. There was something about him that grew with every gesture, a silent dignity that began to impose itself over the luxury and contempt. The old man took a step toward Julian. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene, but the gleam in his eyes was enough to unsettle the millionaire. "Words have weight, young man," he said, "and everyone here heard yours." A chill ran through the room. The humiliation was beginning to shift direction, though no one yet understood how much was left to be revealed. The murmur of the crowd became a restless wave. No one knew which side to take. Some looked at Julian Arce expectantly, hoping he would reassert himself as the undisputed king of the night. Others watched Don Ernesto with unexpected respect, as if something invisible forced them into silence. Julian regained his forced smile and raised his voice. "Do you really believe this old man has a right to anything?" He laughed, raising his wine glass. "Starting a car doesn't make him the owner. Anyone could do it if they got lucky." Don Ernesto, instead of responding with words, turned his gaze back to the Ferrari. He bent down, opened the front hood, and lifted it with a confident movement. The engine gleamed under the hall's lights, a metallic heart exposed naked. The crowd leaned in curiously. "What's he doing?" asked a woman in the front row. The old man passed his hand over the parts without touching them, as if reading a book in Braille. He pointed to a valve and murmured, "Badly calibrated. The adjustment is minimal, but it robs power on startup." The comment landed like a thunderbolt. Some laughed, others were left speechless. Julian tensed. "And what do you know about calibrations?" he scoffed. Don Ernesto looked him straight in the eye without flinching. "Enough to recognize that someone has pushed this engine too hard on the track. They over-revved it in fifth gear. If it continues like this, it'll blow before 10,000 kilometers." A heavy silence fell over the room. Several guests, experts in luxury cars, exchanged uneasy glances. What the old man said didn't sound made up, it sounded like a precise diagnosis. Fernanda, her heart racing, couldn't contain herself. "How can you know that?" she asked aloud, breaking through the barrier of murmurs. Don Ernesto simply closed the hood calmly. "Engines talk, miss. You just have to know how to listen." The phrase hung in the air, charged with a strange weight. Some guests felt a chill. This wasn't a beggar talking, it was someone who knew secrets they would never understand. Julian, increasingly uncomfortable, tried to regain control. He stepped forward and extended his hand, demanding the keys. "Enough theatrics. Give me those and get out of here." But Don Ernesto didn't move. He clutched the keys in his bony hand and responded in a voice so low it forced everyone to lean in slightly to hear. "You called me onto the stage, Julian. You gave me your word." The audience held its breath. The tension was so thick it seemed even the air had stopped moving. Julian swallowed hard. He couldn't let a man with nothing corner him in front of everyone. "It was a joke," he repeated, more nervous than before. "No one here thinks you have the right to." "I do," Fernanda interrupted, surprising everyone. Her voice resonated, firm and clear, breaking the audience's complicity with the millionaire. Several turned toward her. The young woman stepped forward and looked at Don Ernesto with respect. A man who treats a machine with that kind of care is no ordinary man. The silence was absolute. Julian glared at her with contained fury, but the seed was already planted. The audience was beginning to doubt who deserved their admiration that night. The tension in the room was unbearable. The recent roar of the engine still vibrated in everyone's bones. And now the silence was louder than any music. Julian Arce downed a gulp of wine, as if the alcohol could restore his control, but his eyes revealed a growing fury. "What are you implying, Fernanda?" he spat with a forced smile that barely hid the venom in his voice. "Do you think this beggar knows more about my Ferrari than I do?" Fernanda held his gaze without fear. "I don't know how much he knows," she said slowly, glancing sideways at Don Ernesto. "But I know what I saw. And what I saw was respect, not mockery. That sets him apart from everyone here." A murmur ran through the room. Some guests looked down, uncomfortable. Others whispered among themselves, debating whether the young woman was right. Julian clenched his fists. He wasn't used to anyone stealing his spotlight, least of all a ragged old man and a woman who dared to contradict him in public. Don Ernesto stood with the keys still in his hand. He hadn't moved an inch, as if calm shielded him from everything. Then, with a slow gesture, he opened the driver's door again. "An engine isn't just started," he said hoarsely. "It's listened to, felt, understood." He sat in the seat, turned the key again, and the roar once more filled the space. This time, instead of immediately turning it off, he gently revved it, measuring every vibration. He moved the gear shift, adjusted the steering wheel, pressed a couple of buttons no one had noticed. The engine sound changed, refining itself, as if suddenly the car responded to an expert hand that understood it from within. "The injection system is out of sync," he murmured without raising his voice. Several men in the audience, connoisseurs of luxury cars, exchanged alarmed looks. One of them couldn't contain himself and stepped forward. "That's true. I noticed something odd about the startup, but I thought I was imagining it." The old man nodded calmly, looking at no one. "It's not imagination. The machine always speaks." The crowd erupted in whispers. Some looked at Julian with disapproval. The cornered millionaire tried to counterattack. "Enough," he shouted, his face reddened. "This is nothing but a cheap trick." Don Ernesto slowly turned off the engine, got out of the car, closed the door with a gentle gesture, and walked toward Julian. His steps, though slow, echoed louder than the music. He looked him directly in the eyes. "There are no tricks here. Only knowledge." Fernanda, moved, stepped forward. The divided crowd fell into reverent silence. In that instant, Julian understood something that chilled his blood. People were no longer laughing with him. They were watching him as the night's fool. And Don Ernesto, with unshakable calm, was about to deliver the next blow without needing to raise his voice. The air in the room was charged, as if every lamp emitted electricity. The crowd had drawn closer, forming a tight circle around the Ferrari, Julian Arce, and the old man who seemed less and less like a stranger and more like a mystery. Julian, sweating, ran a hand over his forehead. The arrogance that had once made him shine was beginning to crack. The public no longer applauded his every gesture, but watched every movement of Don Ernesto Salgado with anticipation. The old man extended his hand. "Bring me a small light. I need to see in detail." No one moved at first, hesitating. It was Fernanda who took out her cell phone, turned on the flashlight, and approached. The white light illuminated the metal engine parts, which gleamed like a hidden treasure. Don Ernesto leaned in and pointed calmly. "Here," he said, barely touching a part with his fingertip. The fuel pump was replaced, but not adjusted to the correct calibrator. "If they insist on racing this car, the pressure will fail." A young engineer among the guests, a specialist in luxury automobiles, stepped forward, surprised. "He's right," he said, examining the area with incredulous eyes. "I checked a similar Ferrari just last month and saw the same mistake." The murmur grew. Every word from the old man became a verdict. Julian tried to regain control. "Don't listen to him. This man doesn't even have a place to sleep, and you want to believe him about a multi-million-dollar engine?" But his words fell flat, without an echo. No one was laughing anymore. Don Ernesto raised his eyes to him with a chilling calm. "Knowledge isn't measured by money, Julian. It's measured by experience. And by scars. The phrase cut through the room like a knife. Fernanda lowered her cell phone light toward the old man's face. His eyes shone, but not with greed. It was something deeper, something that resonated with truth. The guests began to switch sides. Some murmured, "Who is this man? He talks as if he built this machine himself. He's no nobody." Julian took a step back, cornered. "Enough. No one here knows who you are. You're a ghost. A nobody." Don Ernesto took a deep breath. He could have responded then. He could have revealed everything, but he didn't. He clutched the keys in his hand, remaining silent. That silence weighed more than any words. Fernanda turned to the audience, unable to contain herself. "Maybe we don't know who he is," she said firmly, "but what he's demonstrating here is worth more than all our titles and bank accounts." The room exploded in murmurs again. Julian, increasingly nervous, searched for allies with his eyes, but no longer found easy laughs. What was once a compliant crowd was now a silent tribunal. And at the center of it all, Don Ernesto stood tall with the serenity of someone still holding the strongest blow for the end. The atmosphere had completely changed. What began as a cruel game was now a silent judgment. The guests, dressed in their finest, no longer drank or laughed. They listened intently to every word, every silence that formed around Don Ernesto Salgado. The old man, key still in hand, stroked the metal as if it were a tangible memory. His eyes, laden with years and wounds, slowly rose toward Julian Arce. "You say no one knows who I am." His voice resonated, deep and measured. "And you're right, because there are those who made sure I was forgotten." The crowd's murmur intensified. Fernanda stepped closer, her heart beating fast. She had been waiting for that sentence ever since she saw the old man touch the Ferrari like someone caressing a lost child. Julian tried to interrupt, nervous. "Enough with the mysteries. You're making this up." But Don Ernesto calmly raised his hand. And the gesture was enough to silence everyone. 30 years of my life," he said, eyes fixed on the car. "I spent around engines like this one. 30 years of grease on my hands, of sleepless nights, of perfecting every valve, every gear." Those present looked at each other, surprised. This didn't sound like improvisation, it was a confession. "You?" someone asked from the back. Don Ernesto nodded. "Yes. 30 years in a factory where passion wasn't measured by clocks or wine glasses, but by sweat and dedication. And one day, it all ended. Someone decided I was worthless." His words landed like a slow knife. Julian clenched his teeth. "Sweating. Lies," he said quietly, but his tone lacked conviction. Fernanda felt a chill. There was truth in every word from the old man. It was the truth of someone who had lived, not with luxury, but with sacrifice. Don Ernesto sighed, lowering his gaze for a moment, as if images from the past struck him violently. When you work on something for so long, you never forget it. Even if they try to erase you, even if they abandon you, the knowledge stays here. He touched his head with a trembling finger, and here, he brought his hand to his chest. The silence was absolute. No one dared move. An incredulous guest broke the quiet. "So, you were a mechanic?" Don Ernesto looked at him sideways with a slight gleam in his eyes. "Mechanic? No. A master." The murmur transformed into astonishment. Julian felt the ground shift beneath his feet. People were starting to put pieces together. Respect grew, and with it, the pressure that marked him as the true pretender. Don Ernesto said no more. He remained silent, as if knowing every word should be saved for the right moment. The expectant hall burned with tension. Everyone sensed that what was coming wouldn't be a simple anecdote, but a revelation capable of shattering Julian's false shine before everyone's eyes. The murmur became unbearable, like a swarm of voices demanding answers. No one took their eyes off Don Ernesto Salgado, who stood tall with a calm that contrasted with Julian Arce's nervous tremor. The millionaire raised his hand, trying to regain authority. Don't listen to him. This old man is just seeking attention. I'm the owner of this Ferrari. I'm the one who worked hard to have it. The words rang hollow. Several heads turned toward him with distrust. Fernanda crossed her arms and spoke without fear. Worked hard, Julian? Or inherited what you never built? A tense silence exploded in the room. Julian glared at her, but the young woman didn't back down. Don Ernesto then breathed deeply and stepped forward. His deep, measured voice cut through the air. I didn't seek attention. I sought justice. He stopped in front of the audience, as if speaking not to Julian, but to everyone present. For 30 years, I worked at the Ferrari factory in Medina. 30 years perfecting engines like this one. I was head mechanic. I trained generations. I put my soul into every design. A murmur of awe ran through the crowd. Some, knowledgeable about luxury cars, opened their eyes in disbelief. But one day, Don Ernesto continued, a bitter gleam in his eyes, they took everything from me. Betrayals. Signatures that erased my name. Decisions that threw me into abandonment. And do you know who was one of the people responsible for that injustice? Faces turned toward Julian. The millionaire swallowed hard, trying to maintain composure. Lies. I wasn't even, Don Ernesto interrupted him with a firm gesture of his hand. Your family, Julian. Your father. Your partners. They bought my silence. They stole the rights to my designs. They left me with nothing. And you grew up flaunting what never belonged to you. The impact was brutal. The crowd burst into exclamations. Some guests stepped back, others looked at each other in disbelief. The pieces were starting to fit, the old man's confidence, his knowledge, his way of treating the Ferrari like his own child. Julian stepped back, his voice breaking. You can't prove anything. You're crazy. Don Ernesto raised the keys, gleaming under the light like a symbol of truth. I don't need to prove it. I built it. This engine carries my fingerprints on every screw. The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared speak. Fernanda, with tears in her eyes, stepped forward. Then this Ferrari is also yours. Don Ernesto slowly lowered his hand. I don't want this Ferrari as charity. I didn't come here begging. I came to reclaim what always belonged to me. My dignity. My name. My place in history. The entire crowd felt the weight of those words. Julian, crumbling, looked for an exit, but everyone was now looking at him not with admiration, but with contempt. The climax had been reached. What began as mockery had now become the most painful trial of his life. The entire room burned with tension. No one drank, no one laughed. All eyes were fixed on Julian Arce, whose face had turned pale, distorted by a mix of fury and fear. Don Ernesto Salgado, in contrast, remained upright with the keys still in his hand, as if holding a symbol of truth no one could take from him. Julian tried to force a smile. If you want them so badly, old man, keep them. He threw his wine glass on a table and extended his hand toward the car. I'll give you the Ferrari. The murmur from the crowd was immediate, not of approval, but discomfort. No one applauded. No one celebrated that gesture, because everyone understood it wasn't an act of generosity, but of desperation. Don Ernesto stepped forward, his shadow projecting onto Julian. His voice was low, but so firm it resonated louder than a shout. I don't want your Ferrari. I don't need charity to silence my story. The silence was total. The guests held their breath. The only thing I want, the old man continued, his eyes shining with contained tears, is what you stole from me. My name. My work. My life. You and yours condemned me to oblivion, but I'm still here. And tonight, in front of everyone, I reclaim my dignity. The words hit like hammer blows. Fernanda, moved, felt her eyes well up. Several people in the crowd nodded silently. The truth was undeniable. Julian stumbled back, tripping on the platform. You have no proof. No one will believe you, he shouted, but his voice sounded broken. A guest raised his voice from the back. I believe him. Another followed. Me too. The murmur grew until it became a chorus of support. The audience that had once laughed with Julian now rose in defense of Don Ernesto. The looks that had once despised him now surrounded him with respect. The old man lifted his chin, breathing deeply. I didn't come to steal anything. I came to remind you that the truth doesn't die, even if they try to bury it. That justice is slow, but it arrives. Fernanda stepped forward and declared with a firm voice, tonight, we've all seen who the true owner of respect is. The applause began timidly, then grew until it filled the room. The sound hit Julian like a final verdict. The millionaire lowered his head, unable to hold the stares that pierced through him. Don Ernesto placed the keys on the Ferrari's hood. He didn't need to take them. He had recovered something far greater than a car. He had recovered his name, his honor, his place in memory. As the applause enveloped him, he closed his eyes for a moment. On his tired face appeared a peace he hadn't known for years. The wound was still there, but dignity had returned. And in that instant, the old man was not a beggar, he was a whole man once more. The echo of the applause that night wasn't just for one man, it was for truth, for the dignity that had been reborn before everyone. Don Ernesto Salgado proved that poverty doesn't erase greatness, and that a heart marked by sacrifice can shine brighter than any luxury. His story reminds us that no one has the right to humiliate another human being. Wealth, cars, jewels, all of that fades. But dignity remains, and when defended with conviction, it becomes an unstoppable force. Maybe you, or someone close to you, has been through something similar, a moment when laughter and contempt tried to make you feel small. This story is a reminder that we shouldn't accept humiliation from anyone. No one is worth more than anyone else. We all have a story, an effort, and a place in this world that deserves respect. If you want to share your experience, the comments are a safe space to do so. Thank you for joining us until the end of this story that touches the heart. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and hit the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave your like if you believe in the invisible power of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, check out the story I've left for you here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you think.